Paula Jo from SederQuilts. Thanks for joining us today. This is going to be a Saturday with SederQuilts, and it's a Puzzling with Paula episode. Not quite sure how long this will take, but we had one of our viewers, Elizabeth, asking about how to handle the end of the quilt. She's anticipating her very first long-arm quilter to be arriving soon, and she's been watching lots of videos and learning as much as she can. But she was wondering, how do you go about finishing it? And she said, I assume you just baste it and quilt it. And that is correct. You're a winner on that. But yes, as always, there are lots of options on how to baste and finish quilting, because sometimes quilts have just a little puzzle we got to work through. But yes, most of the time, once we get towards the end, we're just going to advance the quilt and we're going to baste it. The biggest question is, do I wait until I'm all the way down before I do it, or do I baste it when I still have, a row and a half or 2 rows left? And sometimes I do one, sometimes I do the other. You'd never guess that of me, would you? But yes, I like to experiment and see what works best most of the time. And sometimes things just need to be a little bit different than the time before. So with this quilt, I'm just about to the end. And I've advanced it, and you can see that I'm right to the end here. So there are a few things to consider on this quilt. Jackie said that, oh yes, she would love to have us use her quilt in some of our videos. So she said, yep, go right ahead and explain things about her quilt. And so thank you, Jackie, and thank you, Elizabeth. So with this quilt getting close to the end, and I have, one and a little bit more than 1 row. Not quite 2 full rows, but a little more than 1. And because this border is just a wee bit full, there's just a little bit of extra right through here, I have lots of options as to how I want to deal with this. First of all, let's just assume that we are in a perfect world and everything is perfectly flat and I don't have any other things to consider. I would baste this probably now. I would advance the quilt just a bit more so that I can get all the way to the bottom here. I would make sure that I have burped and fluffed, and you've seen me do that before, but I would burp it and fluff it, and I would just love it into place and get everything nice and happy here, and make sure that everything is nice underneath. And because there's a little bit of fullness, I sometimes will baste from the center out and then from the out in, just to help keep everything nice and square. If things would be happier if they were winged out just a little bit, we don't want that. We want to try to keep everything as square as possible. So I would baste down the side, and then I would come in a little ways. I'd come over here, I would baste the edge and come in a little ways, and then, just like if you were doing a ruffle on a skirt, you gather things and you pin things and you split your halves and then you split your other halves and you split the quarters, and you can pin things or you can just pull it a little bit, ease it all in. And I like to just try to keep things as happy where they are. And so sometimes I baste in sections in order to keep everything as flat and happy as possible. So if you're more of a computery quilter, you probably just baste on one side and you baste across and you baste up and you call it good. Because I have done free motion for so many years, I putz with it and probably take too much time usually. But I just want to baste each section so that I can keep everything as square as possible and keep working into the center. I oftentimes mention frosting a cake that's still a little too hot. If you have a freshly baked cake and it's not cooled, and you try to put the frosting on, the top layer of the cake picks off easily with the frosting. And so one of the things that works is if you really keep swooping things a little bit and keep pushing things out to the edges so it's stuck to the edge of the pan, and you just have to be kind of careful how you move it around. That works nicely. And in my head, in my visual hands-on way of thinking, I think of that as I'm quilting sometimes. So in order to baste it and keep the corners as square as possible and ease in things, I sometimes will baste in sections. I know you probably didn't want to hear that, but that really works well sometimes. One of the most important things to not do, because it's just as important to know what doesn't work as to know what does work. The most important thing when you get to the end and you're floating a quilt is you don't want to stretch it. It is so easy to pull things a little too tight, to pull the back a little too tight, and then that's going to be stretched and the top is going to be loose and soggy, or to leave the back just not too tight, but then to pull the top too tight. And actually that's the main reason, well, no, there's lots of reasons why I float rather than attaching to the leader grip on here. I don't even have a leader grip on this bar, but I used to. I have, this is my third quilting system, but on the previous two I did have a leader on here, and I would sometimes pin the top of the quilt on this bar and I would roll it up like they teach you to do. But I almost always stretched those tops too much. I'd stretch it east and west a little bit too much, putting it on in the first place, kind of like what we'll talk about with borders, trying to make them smooth and even. And then if things were just ever so slightly wonky, and because it's not a perfect world, things would stretch a little tight and other areas would be a little loose, and trying to, you know, tighten it just enough to make it all smooth and whatnot, it would stretch. And then when you finally take it off the frame, it would just shrink up and it would be awful. And I couldn't figure out why my quilts wanted to roll a little bit on the edges. Well, it's because I was pulling them too tight, trying to get every wrinkle out of things. And then that causes tension issues with your thread too. But yeah, when you float them, when you get to the end, you want to have the back just tight enough, not too tight, just barely tight enough. There's just a little bit of give. And then you want to love the top into place, burp it and fluff it, and just make it happy and where you want it to be and where it wants to be. And if it's a little bit wonky or off, it's going to be prettier and happier, and you can always trim it a little smoother if you need to. But yeah, don't stretch it. Oh, it is so easy to stretch this last little bit, trying to make it perfectly smooth and straight. And oftentimes that's not the better option. So anyway, speaking of options, let's look at the rest of them. When you are machine quilting and you're trying to work in a little extra, sometimes using soup cans works really well. Let me back up and explain why. As we baste, if things are a little full and we're trying to ease in some extra fullness, can you latch the two hooks there while I get this piece of hair out of my face? So as I baste my edges, I oftentimes start by the belly bar and work my way up, because then it is easy to pull a little bit and create a little extra tension so that I can ease any fullness in along the side. If I start at the top and I baste down, it plows snow. I live in Minnesota, and around here, if you're plowing snow, it just all keeps pushing and pushing and pushing and piling up and spilling over. When I am quilting, if I am basting something and there's a little bit of fullness somewhere, and you're just going in a very straight line, it just keeps moving and pulling, and it just builds up, and it gets icky. So I always, almost always, use more of a wiggle ditch when I am basting, because it just helps. It's like that frosting again. It just helps keep things a little bit smoother, a little bit happier, and it doesn't just push it, okay? So I baste most of the time on the sides from the belly towards the back to allow some tension. When I'm basting across the side here too, no, I've got it clicked into place. As I'm coming along, again, I push with my hand behind where I've been, and I just keep walking it, and adding that little extra pressure helps to stretch this out and ease it in. And this little bit of fullness, it's not much. It's just a little bit. If I do it in sections and I keep pulling from this way, and then I stop, and then I come from over here and I go this way, and again I can pull some of that excess out of the way. See, there's hardly any fullness left when I get up in here. So again, creating that little bit of pull helps keep that in place. Reversely, if I could somehow lift from the bottom, that would take up that excess little bit of fullness. So the soup cans, if you have the soup cans on either side and they're just rolling back and forth, they are going to create that little bit of lift and pressure down, again, to help take out some of that fullness. And you know, you're just going to keep moving them along a little bit. The first one's going to roll out of the way as you go, and you can just keep bringing the back one in. That sometimes works really, really nicely. It's an extra set of hands. So those are some of my thoughts about how to go about basting that. Because, you know, in a perfect world, you just baste it and you don't think too much about it. But in my little brain, oh my, you know, the fireworks of ideas are going, and I'm thinking of lots of puzzles that I might have to fix. So anyway, those are some of my thoughts there. So now, I've already said what I'm probably going to do on here. I have had some quilts in the past where when I got down to the end, I had just way too much fullness in the border, and I just couldn't deal with it. So
what
now,
causes fullness in the border?
Ooh, good question. Good question. What causes fullness in the borders? Okay, so let's back up. Let's back up. When you're getting ready to put your borders on, where is my tape measure? Oh, here it is. I didn't put it back where it belonged. I left it where I was using it. You use a metal construction tape measure because they don't stretch. And you measure the quilt not just only where you're going to be putting this first border on, but you measure the quilt in several places and you take the average. If this edge is a little bit too big, you want that border to hold it in, to frame it into where you want it to be. If this edge is a little too short compared to the rest of the quilt, you want to stretch it just a little bit. You want this border to make it where it's supposed to be. And then you pin it in several places and you stitch that on and you keep stretching or easing so that your frame, your border is where you want it. I come from a very utilitarian quilting background, and I was pretty self-taught. If you've read some of my things and been following me for a while, you might know that I started sewing and quilting and crocheting and knitting and things like that when I was really little. I was just a knee-high to a grasshopper, and my mama was just trying to keep me busy and out of trouble. And so I did not have a lot of training when I started. And when I first started putting borders on, I would just have a strip that was more than long enough, and I would just start putting it on and I would just sew. And you know, you try to keep it nice and even and flat, and by the time you get done, that border was way too long and it was all roughly and full, and well, then I would just kind of stretch it and cut it off and go again. And yeah, my borders used to be terrible. And then I met Darlene. Darlene is such a nice piecer, such a perfect piecer. Everything is so flat and nice and whatnot. She always uses pins and rulers and measures everything twice at least before she cuts it, and she pins everything into place. I don't like using pins. I just kind of like to sew and go, and that was why my borders were always so bad. So I do almost always pin or clip it, my borders in place now when I'm adding them. And I measure numerous times, and you want that border to be the right length and keep everything square. And as you add each border, then they stay in really nicely. My old method, as you add each border, it just ruffles and ruffles and ruffles and ruffles, and oh my goodness. Then I get to be creative and artistic as I quilt, and I play with all that extra fullness and create some cute little ruffle to it. But that's not what most people really want. So anyway, I hope that was clear. If not, ask me a question. We'll have a whole series on just borders someday. So, where was I with the original question here? If there's a little too much fullness in your border, you could correct it many different ways. This is going to be a little hard for some of you to follow, but first of all, if I was quilting a tighter, denser pattern, when you quilt and stitch, there's stitch scrunch. So if something is a little full and you do a lot of quilting, it just scrunches it up and it's going to lay all nice and flat. I like to have a little extra fullness when I'm stitching heavily. Or if, the other way around, if there is a lot of fullness, I like to stitch a little heavier and denser because it's going to just take up all that excess. I'm doing an edge to edge on this. It's computerized, edge to edge, and because it's stars in a night sky, I wanted it to be a little bit more open. I didn't want to quilt it to death. I wanted nice fluffy clouds and stars, and it's a little more open. So yeah, my quilting, the stitching is not going to take up enough scrunch for this little bit of fullness here. So that's not a good option on this particular quilt. Another way to take care of excess fullness in a border, piano keys. Oh my, piano keys are wonderful because you can pin and pin and pin and pin and pin and pin and get everything just where you want it, and all that little bit of fullness, and you stitch up and you move over and you stitch down and then you move over and you stitch up and you move over. You can fill in and take up all that excess, and it just creates a nice little bit of poof and texture. And oh, piano keys are wonderful if you have full borders. These are not full enough for that. And again, I'm using an edge to edge computerized. I did not start out making piano keys, although I'm just artistic enough, I'm artsy-fartsy enough, I'm random abstract and asymmetrical enough that, oh my, if I talked to Jackie and asked her enough questions, because it's really important, what do you want on your quilt? It's not just about what I would want to do, it's what the client wants. So I'd have to ask Jackie, but if this was a little too full to just baste it and quilt it, one of the things that I think would be cool would be to add piano keys just in this bottom corner. And then whether you want it on the top or whatnot, it's a square quilt, so she could display it any direction she wants. But everything else is really nice and flat and square, and I could come up to here without any problem whatsoever. I could crop out over here with that last pass of the pattern, and I could add just some really cool stuff in the border over here. I could maybe put Twinkle Twinkle Little Star and write it in there. I could do piano keys over here. I could love Auntie Jackie in the corner. I could stitch all kinds of stuff over here and have enough stitch scrunch to make that just love it into place where I want it to be. So that's another option when you have something kind of goofy like that. Okay, let's say that no, Jackie does not want anything weird and goofy and artistic and, you know, asymmetrical like that. Okay, another thing we could do, because I still have plenty of room, I haven't eliminated my options yet, I could unstitch this border. I could unstitch all the way back to here, because this is perfectly smooth back here. There's no extra fullness. It's easy peasy over here. And I could just extend that out a little bit, and we'd probably have half inch, maybe an inch or so, maybe an inch and a half of extra, you know, border here that we could just extend it and make it really perfectly flat. Okay, we could stitch with the quilter, with the long arm, and we could just stitch it right here. Okay, we'd lay it out there nice and flat and put it on, and you could stitch through it. You would see that one stitch line on the back, and the back of this is really super cute. But if we're on navy blue there, we could use navy blue and it would hold it in place, and it would be a good possibility if it didn't show too much. Or we could advance the quilt, and because I still have plenty of room, we could hang it over the edge, and I could bring my little table over here, and I could set up my sewing machine, and I could sew this with a domestic sewing machine right over here, and we could just keep moving a little at a time and stitch that on there without stitching through the batting and stuff, and just fix that border. Okay, and yeah, and then that way it would not show from the back. We could just love it into place, and it would be good. Okay, but I'm not going to be monkeying with it because there's not that much fullness. I'm just exaggerating a little bit. There's a teeny little bit of fullness, and it was just enough that, ooh, I wanted to puzzle it out and explain to you. So, another thing that we could actually do is we could use starch, and we could use steam. I oftentimes will bring my ironing board and put it underneath here and raise it up and loosen this and drop it down, and I will press and whatnot. I have sensitivities and allergies to smells and chemicals and whatnot, so I don't like to use starch unless I absolutely have to, because then I have to wear gloves and I have to wear a mask and have to try not to touch it, and I touch the quilts a lot when I quilt. So I usually don't use steam. I don't use starch, but I do use steam and try to love it into place and whatnot. Another thing, you may have seen some of my videos in the past where I was doing some border surgery. Because this border is pieced, there's a diagonal line here. Okay, and there's another one towards the corner. We could just open up these two seams, not adjust the border side seam here, but just these two, and we could just love that over that way and fold it over, and we could love this one over and fold it over and change it, and we could use some Misty Fuse, and we could glue that edge. It's a heat activated adhesive, and there's no smell and whatnot. It's wonderful. But I've done that before too. I've opened up these little seams, and I've just taken out some of that fullness and overlapped it and pressed it in place where I want it, added a little bit of Misty Fuse and stitch over it, and it's good to go. That works really well too. Oh my. I think that's most of the options that I wanted to talk about. But anyway, back to your question, Elizabeth. Yes, basically everything is going to line up nicely because you've been being very careful as you go along in advance, and you're burping it and fluffing it and keeping it exactly where you want it, and you're working all the fullness in and keeping it straight. And yeah, you just base those edges and you finish out quilting the pattern, and it's good to go. And if your world is not perfect and there are a few little puzzles, I'd be happy to help you come up with the options that might work for you. And then you just have to pick and choose with your client which options are a no-go and which options, yeah, I could be happy with that. And there's more than one way to skin any rat, like my mama always says. So curious minds want to know, what did I really do on this quilt? So I've basted the two edges, I've loved it into place, and I've put some pins in here because the pass that I'm going to do now is going to go from here, and it's going to go just barely slightly into this next border. So I have it pinned so it won't be moving as the stitch scrunch goes along, and it will stay in place nicely. So yeah, I've got pins anywhere from 4 to 8 inches apart here, and I'm going to add a couple more before I start stitching. See, it all fit in there perfectly. Beautiful. That's what I did. So anyway, I hope that was helpful. I hope it wasn't too terribly confusing, and I hope you could keep up with me. So anyway, if you have a good quilty question or a quilting puzzle project, you can leave a question or a comment or a suggestion in the comment section below. And I realized something today, that sometimes it's kind of hard to find the spot for that. So if you are watching a video and you scroll all the way to the bottom, let me do that again for you so it's a little easier to see. I did that kind of quickly. Okay, so if you're watching one of my videos, we'll just pause it so it's not quite so noisy. If you can scroll all the way to the bottom, just keep flipping through and through, and when you get to the bottom, now you can add a comment. And oh, see, here's Elizabeth's question right here about the ending. But you can add a comment down here. So you might have to search for it a little bit. But otherwise, you can look in the description underneath the video, and you can click the link to get to SederQuilts.com, or you can cut and paste and send me an email at SederQuilts@gmail.com. We'll try to answer your question with as many options as possible because I like options. Thanks so much. Toodaloo. See you next time.